In this video, we're going to look at how to define variables in PowerShell. Variables are ways to store pretty much output from commands, strings, pretty much anything you want in memory, and then reference that later on. To assign a variable, you'll use this $ variable syntax. So the $ is kind of the identifier, and then variable, in this case, is the name of the variable. I am going to assign this variable to the string nice. And now when I output that variable, you can see that that value is returned. All variables in PowerShell are .NET objects. So if I were to actually output this, you'll see that this object is a system.string. So even though I'm just kind of using a primitive type, it's still an object and it still has a bunch of parameters and methods on it. So for example, if I wanted to reference one of those parameters or methods, I could just use this dot and then length to get that value. By default, you should probably go with easy to use variable names, but if you do have variables that have weird characters in them, one thing you can do is you can use this squiggly brace syntax. As you can see, this weird variable has a space, it has a hyphen in it, and it even has an exclamation point at the end. So if I were to output or execute that and assign it to test, I can output it with the same syntax. So you can put kind of weird variable names in PowerShell. In addition to getting and setting variables in kind of the default syntax, you can also use the variable commandlets, and these can be good for discovery, for setting special options on variables, and that kind of thing. So if you just run get variable by default, it's just going to output all the variables that are currently defined. This includes variables like the built-in ones like the host and the current culture of the command prompt and that kind of thing. You can access individual variables using just the name and also wildcards. So if I do that, it just outputs my one variable. And if I include the value only flag, then I can actually get the value of that variable. And that's kind of effectively what you do when you say $variable. And in addition to just getting variables, you can also set variables with a set variable command. And what this is kind of cool for is it allows you some additional features, like setting options for the variable or a description for the variable. So I can actually create a read-only test variable here. I'll just set it to cool. And now I have, I think I already had that one in my session, so I'll remove that. Let's run it again. Now we have a read-only variable, and if we actually get that variable and pipe it through format list, you'll see that we can get some additional information about it, like the fact that it's read-only, and our description. It works just like a regular variable, even though it's read-only. I can output it. If I attempt to clear it, you'll see that I can't because it's read-only. Clear variable effectively sets the variable to null. If we call remove variable without force, we have the same problem. And if we call remove variable with force, it can remove the read-only variable. And then we can test to see if that's null, and you can see that's true because it's removed that variable. Some other features of variables is the ability to specify a type. So much like a parameter or something like that, you can actually denote a type on the left-hand side here. If you don't do that, it's just kind of inferring it from the value that you provide. But in this case, what I'm doing is I'm actually passing a string 1, 2, 3 to an integer variable. So if I do this, what we end up with is my number is 1, 2, 3, but if I do get member on that, you'll see that it's an int 32. So it's not a string, it is actually an integer. If I were to attempt to pass something that doesn't automatically convert to an integer to this int variable, you're going to see I get an error because it can't convert not a number to an int 32. So anything that converts to an int 32 would work, but in this case, that does not convert. So similarly, I could do something like this where I have a date, and if I do get date, that works because I'm assigning a date to it, and you can see that my date is there. But now that this is a date time, even if I try to assign something else to it, like I'm assigning a 10 here, you'll see that that works because it can convert that 10 to a date. And if I were to actually output this, you'll see that Monday, January 1st, it did date min value effectively. So it converted that 10 into a date because that is a date time variable. Another way to access variables is the variable provider. So if we move over to the variable provider, you can see there's actually a drive called variable. And if I run get child item on there, it's the same thing that gets output when we call get variable. We can even create new items or new variables using the variable provider. So I have new item, the path is the variable drive, the name is the name of the variable, and then the value is whatever we want to put in that value. I think I could do force. And now my path variable outputs, and you can see that it's that nice value. So just another way to kind of access variables. I honestly don't see people using the variable provider all that much. It is a little handy because it does work with the whole provider system, but just be aware that it's there. Now we're going to talk about scopes. So I think scopes are probably the most confusing part of variables, and I am going to show some different types of scopes, and then we're going to go through some examples of working with scopes. So first of all, there's kind of three basic scopes. There's the global scope, which is for the entire PowerShell run space. Any global variables you can update from anywhere and access anywhere. So you want to be careful with global variables, obviously, because they can be dangerous because you can update them from anywhere and access them from anywhere. So you got to be a little cognizant of what you're doing with a global variable, but know that that's there. A script variable is tied to the scope of the current script or the module that you're using. So script scope can be useful, especially in modules that maintain state. So you may want to connect to a service and then store that connection information in a variable, and you could do that with the script scope inside your module. And then local scope is pretty much what we're using by default. You kind of don't need to include that local identifier to define a local scope variable. Alright, so let's look at some examples of scope. So I have a function here called scope1, and it is assigning a variable the value of 1, 2, 3, and it doesn't use any scope identifiers, so it's actually assigning this in local scope. So let's define that function, and now let's actually go ahead and call that. So what I'm going to do is write host just so we can kind of differentiate the command from the output. And then I'm going to assign a variable with the same name as the one in scope 1 to 2, 3, 4. Then I'm going to call scope 1. Then I'm going to output the variable again. So if we run this, what we see is that the output was 1, 2, 3, and 2, 3, 4. The reason that is because I set this variable at kind of the script scope, and then we called the function which entered the function scope. So this variable is locally scoped to the function. So when I assign the variable and output it, it's not actually affecting this outer scope. It's only affecting the scope of this function. So that is using local scope in this case. And that's why we see 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 4, because this variable was not updated by the function. It was updating its own variable within the function. So now let's look at another example of where we actually edit the variable outside the scope of the function. So in this case, I have scope 1 again. This time this function is going to call set variable, and it's going to use the scope parameter. So the scope parameter allows you to define the scope of the variable. You can do things like script and global there, and you can also step up the call stack. So this actually goes up one scope is what it's saying. I want to set the variable in the scope that is calling me. So instead of just updating the local scope, it's effectively going to update the variable outside of the function. So if I were to call the same thing again, where I have variable 2, 3, 4, scope 1, and then variable, what you'll see is that it's 1, 2, 3 both times. And the reason is because once I called scope 1, what it actually did is it updated the variable at the scope above that function. So effectively, it kind of escaped the function and updated the scope there. So that may or may not be useful to you. It's good to know that that is available, and again, you got to be a little careful with what you're doing there when you start like moving out of scopes, because it can kind of be hard to track down what's happening there. So now let's look at some additional module scoping, because modules are a little bit different. They actually have their own scope. And what we'll see here is I have a module, PSM1 here, and we have scope 2, which I'm doing the same thing where I'm stepping out of my scope and I'm updating a variable above my scope. Then I'm setting or outputting that variable, and then I'm going to set a couple other things like a global variable and a script variable. So let's look at the first example where we output this, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to call write host variable 234, call scope 2, and then output the variable. You can see that I have 123 and 234, which is a little weird because we use this set variable, but we can't escape the scope the same way when we're using a module. So it did not effectively update that variable outside of the module scope, and what we end up with is that variable has not been updated by scope 2. So modules have their own scope that they can't really escape. So it's good for I guess users of modules, because otherwise modules could like affect the kind of script scope and you wouldn't really know. So let's take a look at global variables. So we ran scope 2. I have a global variable in here called global var, and I set it to from module. So what you'll notice is with global scope, that can be updated from anywhere. So global scope in this case is available in the script itself, and the module can update and read that global scope. So that is why I say you got to be a little careful with global scope, just because it can be updated from anywhere. And now finally let's look at script scope. So in this case I set this script var to from scope 2. So this variable here, it looks like it's defined within the script or the function scope, but because it has a script identifier on it, it's actually kind of module scoped now. So I set the variable here, and now what I can actually do is access that variable from other functions within my module. So you'll see that I have scope 3 here, and that's just going to output that script variable. If I run that, you'll see that that was updated from scope 2. And this is kind of where you would store connection information or state of the module. Like you can think of like a VMware connection or Hyper-V connection or something like that. You would store that in script scope, and then you could use that in all the other functions inside your module. So yeah, scopes are probably the I guess the most complex part of modules. But other than that, I think they're pretty straightforward. You can choose to use the module or the variable commandlets if you need to, or even if you wanted to, you could use the variable provider. But for the most part, you're just going to be getting and setting variables, potentially using methods and piping them to other commands and that kind of thing. So in this video, we went over the basics of variables in PowerShell.